When war broke out between Germany and Poland on September 1st, 1939, Adolf Hitler took a calculated gamble with the mass deployment of German armoured units in the east. After England and France had declared war on the German Reich on September 3rd, 1939, a front line emerged in the west. In the theatre of war now known as the Western Front, there were on paper at least 32 German divisions in existence, but 20 of these large units had been formed only a few months previously from newly conscripted recruits. Unit training was as bad as weapon supply, and only 12 divisions were fully operational. A carefully targeted frontal relief attack from the vastly superior French army would have found the German army contained in the east very vulnerable on its western flank. The Western Front was almost totally exposed, and in order to protect it from danger, the Germans avoided everything that could possibly have led to an open eruption of fighting. The aim of the German High Command was therefore to focus initially on a speedy and triumphant conclusion to the operation against Poland, so that their exposed Western Front could rapidly be stabilized by means of troop transfers. Adolf Hitler's instruction that petty French border violations should be dealt with on a strictly local basis proved to be a shrewd tactical maneuver. The Second French Army crossed the German border for the first time on September the 8th, and by September 12th they had penetrated up to 6 kilometers inside the territory of the Reich. As ordered, the German troops only used delaying tactics and even ceded a section of the approach to the Siegfried Line to the enemy in the hope that he would not fight, which is exactly what happened. Whereas in Poland they'd been hoping for a decisive Western relief attack for weeks on end, and, what is more, in anticipation of this had even included Warsaw in the struggle, France, brought into the war against Germany, had not the slightest intention of marching. So here in the West a strange ghost front came into being, which certainly did not give the impression that here were two desperate foes confronting each other.
Lautsprecher werden in Stellung gebracht, mit denen für die französischen Soldaten Musikstücke, unterbrochen von Nachrichten und Mitteilungen in ihrer Muttersprache, übertragen werden. Die Musik aus den deutschen Lautsprechern lockt die Franzosen aus ihren Bunkern. Unsere Soldaten machen sich in ihrer Freizeit bei der Bevölkerung nützlich. Bei der Weinlese und Ernte helfen sie gerne mit.
Apart from a few small localized skirmishes, there were actually no significant military conflicts between September 1939 and the spring of 1940. German and French soldiers faced each other with near goodwill, as evidenced by the way the German soldiers discharged the French prisoners of war.
Die bisherigen Kämpfe kosteten die Franzosen erhebliche Verluste. Allein bis zum 18. Oktober wurden 25 französische Offiziere und 664 Mann gefangen genommen.
On October 19, 1939, a communiqué from the German Wehrmacht made the surprise announcement of the retreat of French troops from German soil. The units, which had gradually advanced between the Pfalzer forest and the Moselle, withdrew back onto French territory. The sit-down war, or the odd war as it was often called, then continued primarily in terms of propaganda. Hitler's policy of aggression in the east had dangerously uncovered the Reich's western flank. The German combat newsreel had been ordered not only to avoid any provocation of the French, but also to show a peaceful, friendly picture of the Western Front. Using banners, various slogans such as "Let's prevent bloodshed" or "The British will fight to the last Frenchman" were pointed towards the opposite bank of the Rhine in order to maintain the calm of the French, who were not particularly eager for war and had been convinced of a speedy demobilization of their army. France was relying on its Maginot Line, the fortification system between Montmedy and Bâle, which emerged between 1929 and 1932 and ran on average 12 kilometers behind the border to the Reich. "21 divisions waited here in their bunkers, almost inactive, for a combat order which never came. Only a powerful and decisive attack by the Western powers could have helped Poland effectively. The overwhelming might of England and France would have enabled them, without a doubt, to make a joint move, and with the more than 1,000 available French tanks, to overrun the Western Front. But nothing of the sort occurred. This then raises the question, did France and England actually want to fight for Poland? Did they enter the war to substantiate a pact of loyalty towards Poland? Or was it out of a quite different motive? If, as was declared, it was all about the liberation of Poland, why did the Allies then neglect to also declare war on the second aggressor, the Soviet Union? With the Red Army invasion on September 17, 1939, Stalin had occupied 3/5 of the Polish national territory, whereas a smaller portion of the territory, only 2/5, was taken by the German Wehrmacht. From the behaviour of the Allies, especially the British, it is obvious that double standards were being applied. On September 3, 1939, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, declared to the House of Commons, "True, Poland is a direct opportunity for there to be war. However, it is not the fundamental cause of it." Poland then, only a means to an end, served as a common justification to their own people and the rest of the world. For the Polish nation, the fateful choice of their Allied partners, acting out of selfishness, heralded initially the terror of German dominion and subsequently decades of bondage under Soviet tyranny. Immediately after the conclusion of the Polish campaign, there began a short period of replenishment, a swift transfer of German divisions westward in order to strengthen the weakened front lines as quickly as possible. The British and French had let slip a great military opportunity to cut into the then vulnerable western flank of the German Reich. At this time, Hitler did not view the risk of war with England, which existed on paper, as inevitable. He still held firm to the thoughts of peace with England, without grasping what his anti-Semitism would bring about there. As a consequence of this, his peace offers of September 29th and October 6, 1939, were turned down by England and France respectively. The racist policy of the Third Reich made any international understandings impossible, and gradually the fronts began to harden. For the further development of the course of the war for the countries involved, the strategic starting positions had increased in significance. While Germany made swift progress on the western border defences by strengthening the Siegfried Line, and at the same time carried out an offensive naval war against England's shipping routes, the Allies attempted to establish a naval blockade against the Reich as they had done previously in World War I, in order to cut it off from the overseas trade. In this respect, the Scandinavian countries now acquired a strategic role of crucial importance. With Norway's occupation by British and French troops, not only would Germany have been cut off from the iron ore supply coming via North Norway from Sweden, and so vital to the war effort, but also the German fleet would simultaneously have been confined to the North Sea and the Baltic respectively. Because of their numerical inferiority, they would have been unable to undertake any escape attempt which looked likely to succeed. In addition, the Norwegian mainland would have more or less provided the facility of a large aircraft carrier for the British and French air forces. Air raids carried deep into the German Reich would have been made considerably easier, particularly where the eastern districts were concerned. Hence, the developing military and industrial threat to the Reich would have become unbearable. With the occupation of Norway and Denmark on the 9th of April 1940, the German High Command forestalled these plans by only 24 hours. A British Franco expeditionary force had already put to sea when German troops, in an operation which was just as hazardous as it was brilliantly planned, took Norway's entire coastline at strategically significant points. Operation Weserübung, the code name for this operation, then gave the German Reich a decisive improvement in their strategic naval starting position against the British Isles. The establishment of a naval blockade against the Reich was then no longer feasible, even for the vastly superior Royal Navy. German fighter planes taking off from Norwegian landing strips could conduct large-scale operations far into the North Sea to survey and monitor the coastal approaches. The static western ghost front remains seemingly undisturbed by all these events. The military reasoning of the French army, committed to the trench warfare doctrine of World War I, now long outmoded, still relied upon the strength of their Maginot Line. The German Wehrmacht held ground in their assembly areas behind the Siegfried Line, and restricted themselves to reconnaissance activity and observation duties.
Im Gefühl seiner Stärke tut der deutsche Soldat seinen Dienst am Westwall. Ablösung rückt ins Vorgelände. Eine Reihe der tief gestaffelten Höckerhindernisse wird passiert. Artilleriealarm! In kürzester Zeit ist alles marschbereit. Batterie leichter Feldhaubitzen geht in Stellung. Der Heeresbericht meldete in letzter Zeit wiederholt leichte Artillerietätigkeit an verschiedenen Stellen der Front.
The first harbinger of an impending attack against the western border was already reflected in this extract from the war newsreel. The German artillery trained for the systematic shelling of the combat sectors assigned to them, while the infantry practiced overcoming wire entanglements and anti-tank obstacles. Offensive tactics were unmistakably being studied. Recognizable preparations for an early attack were obvious to the keen observer. So these films would be used both to convey to the home front and the civilian population a feeling of the security and strength of the Wehrmacht, and at the same time to make the enemy aware of the danger of an attack against the German demarcation line. Hitler's aggressive military policy, apparently justified by the swift successes during the Polish campaign and the successful occupation of the Scandinavian countries, now found its continuation in the concentration of power in the western flank. The planning and execution of military actions now completely monopolized the enemy's thinking. Like figures on a chessboard, troop formations and motorized units were moved backwards and forwards again and again. The European continent, lit by the Polish fuse, had long since caught fire. A fire that was devouring hundreds of thousands of soldiers from every nation. There was no longer a place for moderate liberal action, aiming at preserving human life instead of destroying it. After the conclusion of the Norwegian campaign, the focal point of the war shifted once and for all to the Western Front. While the British continuously reinforced the French army by means of an expeditionary force, the Germans once more regrouped. Everything was then concentrated on the great, decisive battle in the West. The Allies favoured the Dial-Breda plan. They planned to proceed from the border of northern France, thrust through Luxembourg, Belgium and Holland, and then penetrate into the heart of the German armaments industry, the Ruhr. It seemed that the consent of the Benelux countries was taken for granted. Their neutrality was in any case questionable. All their defences were to be directed solely towards the German Reich. It was clear they only intended to protect themselves from this direction. After General von Manstein had had his plan to attack the West personally accepted by Hitler, the Führer declared to the commander of the army and his chief of staff that, in lieu of the spearhead planned, a powerful battering ram would have to be formed in Army Group A. And thus the concept of the sickle cut prevailed. The German forces, which were to be organised into 3 army groups, would attack with Army Group B, under Generaloberst von Bock, making the assault on the right wing, Generaloberst von Rundstedt's Army Group A moving in the middle, while the left wing, Generaloberst Ritter von Lieb's Army Group C, would, for the time being, hold the front at the Saar and Oberrhein. In the night of May 9th through to May 10th, 1940, the final orders were given.
Und immer wieder hageln die Granaten unserer schweren Artillerie auf den Feind. Vor uns der Rhein. Im Schutz des schwersten Trommelfeuers bereitet die Infanterie den Übergang über den Rhein vor. Der erste Floßsack geht hinüber. Mit eiserner Ruhe führen die deutschen Infanteristen ihre Aufgabe durch. Am anderen Ufer wird sofort Stellung bezogen. Es muss ein Brückenkopf für die Arbeit der Pioniere geschaffen werden. Ein schwerer Granatwerfer. Dem ersten Stoßtrupp folgen Sturmpioniere. Pioniere sind heran. Mit ihren Flammenwerfern sollen sie die Panzerwerke ausräuchern. In erbittertem, zähem Kampf, der keine Schonung kennt, geht es von Bunker zu Bunker. Hier bewährt sich die Ausbildung des deutschen Westwallsoldaten, der immer wieder für diese große Aufgabe vorbereitet und geschult wurde. Die erste Linie des Gegners ist durchbrochen. Die Pioniere können im Schutze von Artillerie und MG-Feuer mit dem Brückenbau beginnen. In kurzer Zeit sind an vielen Stellen der Front Brücken über den Rhein geschlagen.
The prominent head of German planning, General von Manstein, had recognized the Allied intentions and had forestalled their plans with a German offensive. The combined strength of the German army deployed on the border comprised 141 divisions, and they faced 144 on the other side. The 3 million German troops were confronted by exactly 3,369,000 French, British, Belgian, Dutch and Polish troops from the regular army who were in service for France. Whereas the French and British armoured units had at their disposal 3,373 tanks, the German army could only muster 2,445 panzers. The disproportion of weapons was even greater. The German army's total of 7,373 guns was set against the 13,947 of the Western Allies. As far as the Luftwaffe was concerned, the Germans had 4,020 aircraft of all types at their disposal, compared with 3,099 Allied planes. It was only here that a numerical superiority swung in favour of the German Air Force. The German Western campaign was divided into two parts, the battle for the Netherlands and Belgium and the battle for France. The attack on Holland and Belgium began on the morning of May the 10th, 1940, with air and paratroop raids on bridges and airfields. In a spectacular action, German paratroopers opened up the Mars line at Maastricht and captured the sturdy Belgian outer fort of Eben-Emael, which the Belgians had considered as impregnable. The fort had a garrison of 1,200 men who were protected in casemates and armour-plated domes, and 42 guns and countless automatic weapons were available to the defenders. The strongest fort in the world was cracked by exactly 78 men of the Fallschirmjäger regiment. They landed with transport gliders in the middle of the fortress and took the Belgian fort garrison by total surprise. On May the 11th, the German panzer divisions had penetrated through the Ardennes, previously thought to be impassable, and so a way was cleared in the Allied defence between Sedan and Dinard. The German panzer units, concentrated in a single group, thrust forward in a westerly direction and arrived at the sea near Noyelles on May the 20th. Thus the Allied armies were torn apart, and General von Rundstedt's sickle-cut plan had been successfully executed. On May the 22nd, the German units turned to the north. Their aim was now the occupation of the Channel harbours. But 2 days later, the Mobile Army Group A units came to a halt, following a surprising command from Adolf Hitler. Generaloberst von Kluge was surprised by the unexpected command to stop. Like von Kleist, he was the firm conviction that they had to advance further. It was only in this way that they could bring about the complete destruction of the enemy's strike forces in the pocket of Flanders, and thus carry the sickle cut through to a satisfactory conclusion. In a long-distance call, Kluge pointed out that the entire panzer force would be neutralized by this command. Every German Wehrmacht general in the West was of the unanimous conviction that Hitler's order to stop, for such a sweeping command could only have come from him, was wrong. However, the Führer still believed there was a possibility of concluding a peace with England. The British Expeditionary Force, cut off from their French compatriots and encircled on the Channel coast, had assembled in the Dunkirk region. Adolf Hitler held the view that the destruction of the 350,000-man expeditionary force would further deepen the rift between Germany and England, and that any willingness of the British to negotiate would be shattered. He had hoped for the surrender of the encircled troops before it came to a decisive fight to the end. Hitler could not at this time suspect that the new British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, had not for a moment thought of the possibility of a separate peace with Germany. Instead of grasping the outstretched hand for a prospect of peace, the British had begun the evacuation of their troops back across the Channel towards England. In his personal memoirs, Churchill himself confirmed that he had discerned Germany's peace intention. Hitler had come to a stop at Dunkirk in order to give England better prospects of peace, and at the same time, by means of his forbearance, to bring about a British willingness for peace. So it was not until May the 26th that Adolf Hitler again gave the go-ahead for the German panzer divisions to advance towards Dunkirk. Due to the tenacious defence of Calais, the Royal Navy in the space of just 9 days was able to save 338,226 men, among them 123,000 Frenchmen, by carrying them back over the sea to England. The German Luftwaffe was not in a position to impede the massive troop transports. On June the 4th, 1940, Dunkirk fell into German hands, and with that, the battle for the Channel coast came to an end. The rescued Allied troops would later form the basis of the invasion army that would land in Normandy in the June of 1944. The German panzer divisions now turned southward and pushed forward into France. In vain, the French generals attempted to form a new defensive line along the Somme and the Aisne. The majority of their troops had, however, lost every faith in their leadership, and their combat morale was at rock bottom. The backbone of the new broad expanse strategy was formed by the German army panzer units. In daring operations, they intruded far into the enemy's hinterland, decided the encounters swiftly by battles of encirclement, and cut off complete defence systems, such as the Maginot Line, from their rearward supplies. The combat units, which were divided into 10 panzer divisions, operated at high speed independently of their supporting infantry. The French armoured units, on the other hand, were split up and allotted to support the slower infantry units. Their leadership, still labouring under the long outdated thought structures of the old World War I strategy, had, in contrast to the German Army Command, not recognised in time the tactical deployment advantage of detached armoured units operating independently. In this strange way, a defending army which was numerically superior was defeated by a weaker attacker. Another essential factor which helped to turn the scales was the fact that the battle-tried German soldiers, baptized in fire in the Polish campaign, were infinitely superior in discipline and morale to the French army. On May the 14th, the Netherlands fell, and on May the 28th, the Belgian army surrendered. As the German victory began to emerge with increasing clarity and the risk therefore lessened correspondingly, Mussolini declared war on England and the already vanquished France on June the 10th, 1940. French newspapers ridiculed his move. Mussolini, the jackal, dares to emerge from the ambush in the shadow of the German tanks. Even in Berlin, the Italian dictator was derided as the harvest helper. The Italian offensive, begun on the face of the Alps, made no progress, and on the first day of fighting, they were driven back over the border in a grim, decisive action by the French. Right up to the armistice, the Italians failed to achieve even a small victory against the French. While Germans, Frenchmen and Britons confronted one another in a fair fight, the insane Duce tried his hand as land robber and opportunist war profiteer. On June the 17th, 1940, the new French government under Marshal Pétain submitted an armistice agreement to the administration of the German Reich. 5 days later, on June the 22nd, in the Compiègne forest at Riton, an armistice treaty was to be signed between Germany, Italy and France.
Der 21. Juni, Tag von Compiègne. Das Denkmal gallischen Hochmuts wird mit der Reichskriegsflagge bedeckt. Die Ehrenkompanie marschiert auf. In der Mitte des Platzes der Wagen des Marschall Foch, in dem die Verhandlungen vom 11. November 1918 stattfanden. Hier sollen nun auch die Waffenstillstandsverhandlungen vom Juni 1940 wieder stattfinden. Der Führer schreitet mit seinen Generälen die Front der Ehrenkompanie ab. Vor dem Foch-Denkmal. Der Stein, der die Erinnerung an die Demütigung Deutschlands vom November 1918 verewigen sollte. Der Führer begibt sich in den Verhandlungswagen. Alles ist hier genauso geblieben, wie es 1918 war. Die französische Delegation erscheint. An ihrer Spitze General Hunziger.
Hitler had had Marshal Foch's railway carriage brought to the Compiègne forest. Here the negotiations so humiliating for Germany had taken place in November 1918 after the end of the First World War. Now the same fate was to be accorded to the French. On the same site they would have to sign the contractual agreement of the German-Italian armistice. After almost 22 years and with an exchange of roles, victor and vanquished once more confronted each other.
Hinter General Hunziger, Botschafter Noël, Konteradmiral Leluc und General Bergeret. Im Auftrage des Führers verliest Generaloberst Keitel die Präambel zu den Waffenstillstandsbedingungen. Der Zweck der deutschen Forderungen ist es, so heißt es darin, erstens, eine Wiederaufnahme des Kampfes zu verhindern. Zweitens, Deutschland alle Sicherheiten zu bieten für die ihm auferzwungene Weiterführung des Krieges gegen England, sowie drittens, die Voraussetzungen zu schaffen für die Gestaltung eines neuen Friedens, dessen wesentlicher Inhalt die Wiedergutmachung des dem Deutschen Reich selbst mit Gewalt angetanen Unrechts sein wird. In dem einstigen Salonwagen des Marschall Foch nehmen die Verhandlungen ihren Fortgang. Nachdem die französische Delegation die Waffenstillstandsbedingungen zur Kenntnis genommen hat, begibt sie sich in das Zelt, um sich mit ihrer Regierung in Bordeaux in Verbindung zu setzen und deren Zustimmung einzuholen.
Am 22. Juni 18:50 Uhr deutscher Sommerzeit wurde im Wald von Compiègne der deutsch-französische Waffenstillstandsvertrag unterzeichnet. Die Unterzeichnung nahmen vor: auf deutscher Seite als Beauftragter des Führers und obersten Befehlshabers der Wehrmacht der Chef des Oberkommandos der Wehrmacht, Generaloberst Keitel. Auf französischer Seite als Beauftragter der französischen Regierung General Hunziger. 6 Stunden nach der Annahme der italienischen Waffenstillstandsbedingungen tritt am 25. Juni morgens 1:35 Uhr die Waffenruhe in Frankreich ein. Der Krieg im Westen endete mit dem glänzendsten Sieg der deutschen Geschichte.
Victory over France for the Germans of 1940 was much more than just the defeat of an enemy. After the ignominious Treaty of Versailles, the German nation's sense of self-worth had been badly hit, and above all, the overbearing and arrogant behaviour of the French in the years between the wars had done much to rub salt into the wound. In contrast to the post-World War I armistice agreement in Versailles in 1918, the peace stipulations now imposed upon France were surprisingly moderate. Although it would have been merely child's play for the German army to occupy the remaining French territory as well, the formation of a French zone under their own administration was permitted. France was therefore able in some respects to retain a certain autonomy up until November 1942. The German High Command was absolutely convinced that after the capitulation of France, Great Britain would finally be prepared for peace. So an over-harsh treatment of the Allies was inadvisable for diplomatic reasons. After this expectation once more proved to be in error, with the British Prime Minister not showing the slightest desire to negotiate, preparations began on the German side for a landing operation on the south coast of England. Operation Sea Lion was to take place in various spearheads from the mouth of the Scheldt up to Cherbourg. In the harbours along the Atlantic coast, a fleet of steamers, barges and all kinds of auxiliary ships were gathered to be refitted as landing ships. 25 divisions assembled for landing had begun appropriate exercises for the planned operation. An absolute prerequisite for the successful execution of such an operation was the attainment of air superiority. In the Battle of Britain now commencing, however, the German Luftwaffe failed to destroy the Royal Air Force. Whether an invasion would have been carried out, and if so, how successful it would have been, remains hypothetical. What was definite was that Adolf Hitler did not actually want to take the risk of Operation Sea Lion. This was the result of the fact that, at the end of July 1940, after England's will to hold out to the end had become clearly recognizable, he had already begun to think about an attack on the Soviet Union. As Stalin was also negotiating with the British, there was the risk of an Anglo-Russian alliance. Hitler was of the opinion that only the collapse of the last continental warriors, as he called the Soviet Union, would finally make England ready for peace. By continuing the preparations for the Operation Sea Lion, Hitler thought he had a good camouflage for the preparation of a Russian campaign. The German Luftwaffe had to continue the Battle of Britain without pause and simply as a red herring, and they sustained formidable losses doing so. On October 12, 1940, Adolf Hitler officially called off Operation Sea Lion, which had been stuck in its preparation phase. Through the victory over France, the Third Reich had acquired the full length of the Atlantic coastline. The Kriegsmarine gained a number of superb bases suitable for use against the British sea routes in the Atlantic. In addition to the destroyers, torpedo boats and patrol boats, it was particularly the German U-boats that occupied the French Atlantic coast bases. Operating out of numerous harbours along the long French coast, a weak German U-boat offensive now began against the British sea routes. From November 1940 to February 1941, the number of available U-boats dropped again and again. There were times when of the 18 boats in deployment, only a third actually faced the enemy. The militarily decisive naval war against the British was begun and continued with totally insufficient resources. The high numerals used as names for the U-boats, such as U-570 or even U-820, did not mean that a corresponding number of submarines were available. They were merely supposed to make it more difficult for the enemy to ascertain the insignificant strength of the U-boat arm. Since the brunt of the sea battles would have to be borne by the U-boats, because of Goering's stubbornness, a naval air force was no more available than a sufficient number of heavy surface forces. Only 120 to 240 submariners conducted the war against the main enemy, the mighty naval power of England. The commander of the U-boats, Admiral Dönitz, demanded again and again 300 U-boats, the figure necessary for a positive naval strategy which was never to be attained. The boats available in the years 1940-41 were able to deal a heavy blow to the hostile Allied escort and supply service, but they could not cut it off decisively. Although this system was the weakest and most sensitive point of British military strategy, here for the first time no decisive military result could be achieved. The German U-boat strategy remained until its complete breakdown in the summer of 1943, full of shortcomings and improvisations. After Hitler, in a fit of megalomania and misplaced faith in his ally Japan, had declared war on the United States on December the 11th, 1941, the face of the war underwent a fundamental change. The actual turning point of World War II had been reached. The Atlantic front, seen as relatively quiet, had become the westernmost end of the German sphere of influence. With the start of fortifications of the Atlantic coast, the inability for an offensive warfare was sealed. So the Western Front existed between 1940 and 1942 primarily as a launching point for the German Navy. In addition to the Atlantic operations of the heavy surface ships, the French harbours served above all as bases for the submarine operations. Military land operations had for the time being come to an end, just like the Luftwaffe sorties against England. Until February 1942, the Western Front moved out of the focal position in the events of the war.